Of those days where where there are things that happen that just threaten to derail you perhaps, or little circumstances come up that are unexpected, and you have to figure out, okay, so how do I move forward even in the midst of this moment? Have you ever had those kind of days? This morning is one of those for me, and for our worship team for that matter. So I just wanted you to know our guitarist got sick right before church started, and so Trish and I had to figure out how to get him home with the two of us being here. And so just first I want to tell you publicly, thank you to David Myers for being willing to go and sit at home with our sick son and risk catching the germs. And so, but I also then want you to know, if this is a great message, then it probably means that God is moving through me, and if it's not, it probably means that I'm stressed. And so you can show me some grace today. That doesn't give me a pass on other weeks when my message is off, but today at least, you can give me some grace. So we are starting a 6-week series this morning called Maybe God. And it's to look at how God speaks and how we can listen. And the idea there is when some of you maybe have seen a text like this where someone sends you a message and you don't yet have them as a contact in your phone or on your iPad perhaps, and so then your phone will give you a suggestion of who this might be based on their contact info or an email you might have, and so it'll say maybe and then list a name and their information. And so sometimes when we sense something or hear something or someone tells us something, we might ask that question, well, maybe this is God speaking to me in this moment. And so that's the general idea, is in those moments where we're asking, well, could this be God speaking to me? How do we answer that? How do we look at that? And so over these next 6 weeks, we'll be looking at different scenes in Scripture where we could ask that question, and we'll try to apply each one in a different way to how we might see or feel God speaking to us, or how we might hear Him. This morning, we will begin in Luke chapter 5, and we're going to look at two stories that are pretty similar in terms of how they go. The first one here is in Luke chapter 5, and there is a notes page in the bulletin if you'd like to take notes and follow along, and some of the scripture is there as well. The story goes, one day as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, the people were crowding around him and listening to the word of God. He saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by the fishermen who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from shore. Then he sat down and taught the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets." Now, just a quick pause in the story here. I think that there have been a couple moments already that we could qualify as those maybe this is God speaking moments. First of all, Jesus gets into a boat and he asks Simon to put out from the shore so he could teach. And so in that moment even, there's this opportunity for Simon to choose, am I going to listen to this guy and put out, or am I just going to say, hey, no, get out of my boat, this is my boat. But he has this moment, I think, where Jesus, God on earth, is saying something to him, and I would say that at least internally he has to answer that question. Maybe this is something I should listen to. Maybe this matters. Maybe this is important. And then, on top of that, not only are they out, but he tells Simon once more, let's go out even further to deep water and let down the nets. And once again, there's this challenge, perhaps, to choose that, well, maybe this is God speaking to me. Maybe this is an authority that I should listen to. And so the first fill in there, and this is kind of a twist now, so it's not just asking, well, maybe this is God speaking, but then asking some other questions such as, maybe God knows better, or maybe God knows what he's asking, or the most concise thing is just, maybe God knows my heart. We so quickly forget or lose focus of what God pays attention to. We think that he pays attention to the outward and the details and all of this, but God sees directly to our heart. He sees to who Peter is. He knows who he is. And so even as Jesus asks him to put out from the shore, and then again asks him to go even farther and let down the nets, he knows Peter's heart, and he knows that this is someone who will do what is asked of him. He knows that this is someone who will listen to an authority, to his master. So continuing in the story, when they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. And so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. And then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on you will fish for people." So they pulled their boats up on the shore, left everything, and followed him. Now just a quick observation. It tells us that he fell on his knees in a boat that was so full of fish that it had begun to sink. And they called another boat over to transfer some of the fish from their boat to this other boat because it was so full. And again, Peter fell on his knees in this boat. Now, again, this isn't central to the story, but I'm thinking that Peter must not have had some of the, what I would call sensory issues that I deal with personally, because I would not get on my knees in a boat full of fish. It just would not happen. You can know that about your pastor. I hate to have anything on my hands, my feet, on my knees that doesn't belong there. I would not have handled this situation well. It would have, not only would it have stunk, but I think I could have dealt with the smell. But immediately, I don't know if you've ever fished and had to take the hook out of a fish, but your hands, they just get oily. I mean, and then it becomes sticky, and it's disgusting. And when you reach your hand out of the boat to rinse it off, it doesn't really take care of it very well. And so then you do this whole thing, and that doesn't actually help all that much either. I want us to imagine for just a moment the smell, the feel of all of that, the disgustingness of it, to kneel down, fall on your knees in a boat full of fish and some water. And yet, Peter, in this moment, he humbles himself. Jesus, I think, knew his heart. And we see his heart in this moment, that even with all of that, now he was a fisherman, so maybe some of that didn't bother him like it would bother me, but even in all of that, he kneels in front of Jesus. He bows before him. And this is significant. This isn't just an outward act. This is something that is not an easy thing to do, to kneel or bow in a boat full of fish that is threatening to sink. Not only that then, but it tells us that both he and his brother, his partners, and James and John, they left everything. Turn off my volume. They left everything, including Dad. James and John left their father Zebedee in the business. They left everything to follow this Jesus. And again, the maybe thing here is maybe God already knows who I am. Peter declares as he humbles himself and he bows down, he says, "Lord, you shouldn't be anywhere near me. Get away from me because I am a sinful man." And Peter sees this thing about him that, well, this Jesus, if he really knew me, he wouldn't be in my boat, he wouldn't have told me to do this, and he wouldn't be with me at all. He wouldn't be anywhere near me because he must not know who I am. I was getting a haircut a couple of weeks ago. Ethan and I went to a new barber. It's a place down on Nob Hill and 9th. And a friend of mine who works at Sam's Club, or Costco, sorry, that was the Midwesterner coming out of me, at Costco, he was telling me where he goes to a barber. He's got a beard, and I trusted him because he likes his beard, and he wouldn't want it shaved off, and I was trying to find a place that would trim it but not kill it. And so I found this place, and Ethan and I went there to get our haircut, and it's a barbershop that is run by several Hispanic guys, and they did a great job. I loved them, and it was a fun place to get our haircut, and Ethan enjoyed his haircut. And as we're sitting there, the barber just casually, so, you have big plans coming up this weekend, and it was leading up to Easter. And so I just chuckled and I said, well, actually, yes, I'm a pastor, and so this is one of the big times of the year for me. And they, all started talking, and several of them are church people, and some of them were not. And so, one of them, at some point, it gets to the place where, in a lot of conversations with the pastor, someone, in order to make sure you don't invite them to church, will just preemptively say, well, you wouldn't want me to come to your church, because if I came to your church, the building might collapse. Something to that effect, that God will strike it with lightning. Or they always say something like that, or I would drop dead upon entering the door. But somewhere it goes in that direction. And my response is always the same. Well, he hasn't done it and he lets me in the building. So you're pretty safe, because I know what I've done, and I don't need to know what you've done to know that if he didn't collapse it on me, he won't collapse it on you. And Peter, I think, is in that situation where he's looking at Jesus and he says, God's going to sink this boat because you're holy, but I'm not, and you shouldn't be anywhere near me, because if I'm near you, I'm somehow going to infect you with my sinfulness. And Jesus isn't concerned about being infected by Peter's or Simon's sinfulness. He is looking to turn Peter into who he knows Peter already is. Because Peter is a man who obeys the master, even when he can't see how it will make a difference. Jesus tells him to put out from shore, and then he tells him to go out even further and cast out the nets, and Peter does it. Now, he points out that he doesn't think it's going to work, but he still does it. And so Jesus sees this about Peter. He's someone who is willing to get down in the muck for God, for Jesus. He bows down in this boat full of fish. He is a man who recognizes who he is when he is faced with Christ. He doesn't try to pretend that he's better than he is. He actually points out to Jesus that he's worse than he actually is. And Jesus sees that this is someone who is a fisherman who can be taught to fish for people. And that this is a man who will leave everything to follow after him. And I think for a lot of us, we will do the thing where we immediately see when God is pulling us in a direction, or we feel this inclination, when we have those moments where Jesus may not physically be there saying, put your boat out from the shore, but he comes to us and he looks at us and he looks at our situation and he says, hey, you are good at this thing, or you have this resource, and I would like you to use this resource with me to do something that will make a difference. In that scene, Peter has the boat. He's sitting in the boat. Jesus says, hey, let's use your boat to teach all these people. If you have a boat, then yes, perhaps God will say to you, let's use your boat. But for a moment, let's just say that we don't have a boat, but we each have something about us, something that is who we are, that God could say, hey, this is you. And I don't want to change you, but I would like you to let me use this part of you to make a difference. And so he asks us to trust him in that moment. And maybe that first step is an easy one. I mean, all it is letting a guy stand in his boat. And so he says, sure, let's put out from shore. Let's go out. I'll let the guy teach. It's not a big deal. I'll just sit there. I'll get a nap, because that's what happens during a sermon. And I'll take a nap, and then, he'll wake me up and we'll go back in. And so, that's the easy step. But then he's out there, and Jesus finishes the message, and he looks down at Peter. Maybe he wakes him up if he fell asleep. I don't know. But he says, hey, let's go find some deeper water and let's throw out the nets. And so here's Peter, who has to make a decision in this moment. Well, what do I do? Because it's been a long night of fishing and catching nothing. And I think this is where we probably are somewhat like Peter, and then when something happens, we tell God, well, these are the reasons why you shouldn't use me ever again. Moses did it in the Old Testament. When God comes to Moses in the burning bush and he calls him to do something, Moses gives God his resume of reasons and references of reasons to not use him. And God just continually says, no, I've chosen you. You're going to do this. I'll go with you. And with us, it's the same thing. I often will tell God all the reasons why he picked the wrong guy to do this. Or, well, you should really ask someone else to talk to them. Or, I'm not the best one to serve in this particular capacity. And God is persistent with us because he knows who we already are and he sees our heart. Now, moving to the next story, which has a lot of similarities, in John chapter 21, we fast forward to the end of the Gospels now, the end of the four books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then John, and this is the end of Jesus' story on earth, essentially, and he's been crucified and raised from the dead, and he's appeared to the disciples, so they know he's alive, they know he's risen, and now they're just kind of waiting, and they don't know what's coming next, and they're kind of wanted men, and they're kind of not, and they're not sure what's going on, and they all ran from the scene when Jesus was going to be crucified, and they didn't stick by his side, and Peter actually denied him 3 times, and so there's this expectation, I think, on their part that, well, that was a good run, and now what do we do? So we followed Jesus, but that's changed, and where is this headed? And so this story begins with the disciples. It tells us that Simon Peter, he looks at the rest of them and he says, hey, I'm going to go out and fish. And so they say, well, we'll go with you. So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. See, there's already a similarity here. They go fishing and they don't do it well. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, friends, haven't you any fish? No, they answered. And he said, throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some. When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. So this is nearly the same miracle as before. It's pretty close. Now, I've fished a lot. I grew up fishing with my grandfather on the Ohio River, and I fished in a little river in the northern part of Indiana called the St. Joe River that runs through South Bend and Elkhart, where Notre Dame University is, and I've fished in other rivers and lakes around the Midwest. So I'm fairly familiar with the concept of fishing. I even spent a whole summer working at a fish hatchery, where what we did for our job was we walked through these stocked ponds with a large net and dragged the net across the pond to catch the fish, and then you take the little ones and you put them in tanks in the building, so when people buy fish or want to stock their pond, you have the little ones to load up and take to their... So I've been around a lot of fish. And one thing that I don't particularly enjoy while fishing is the people who tell you how you should be doing it better. And most of the time, they haven't caught anything either, right? I mean, they're not having any better luck. I've been in a boat sitting in a lake in Tennessee, and this, the guy who's running from our church, the guy who's running the motor in the back, because I was a teen, and apparently that means I can't drive a boat, as if it's that difficult to just do this. But anyway, so my buddy and I are sitting on the other end of the boat fishing, and he's sitting in the back of the boat fishing, and mind you, he has caught exactly the same number of fish that we have caught up to this point, which is all of 0. And he begins to tell us what we should be trying instead, as if that will all of a sudden work. Or, maybe we should try this spot over here. Every other spot he's picked has not helped at all. However, now all of a sudden he's an expert, and he's going to solve the situation for us. And so I wonder if there's a little bit of that feeling by the disciples, both in the first scene and this scene, where they're like, we're professional fishermen. Who does this guy think he is? He stepped into the boat and told us to put out from shore. Or in this scene, it's some dude calling from the shore. He's not even in the water. He's not fishing. How does he know what we should do? And furthermore, what difference is it going to make to put the net on the other side of the boat? It goes to the bottom of the water. If I put the net over here, it's the same spot of water as this side of the boat. It's not like there's that much difference between the two. If the fish are not over here, guess what? They're probably not over here either. And so if I'm one of them, I'm probably out there like, oh, great, we have another expert. Thanks a lot, sir. We'll try that next time, and fold up the nets and be like, whatever, I'm not listening to this guy. But for some reason, maybe they recognize who this is. They try it out, and it happens again. And so it says, the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." And the maybe God moment in this is maybe God knows what to say to me. Or maybe God knows how to get my attention. Maybe God knows how to speak to me. Or the easiest way to say it would probably be, maybe God knows me. But I thought that sounded a little too much like one of the other points. So you can write that however you want. But I would say maybe God knows how to get my attention. And he speaks to these guys about catching fish to get their attention. Because this is something that they will notice. This is something they will pay attention to. This has been their livelihood for a long time. It provides for their families. And they've spent a whole night catching nothing, providing nothing. They've gone out to bring home the bacon, and they haven't brought home any bacon. They're not even bringing home a pig's hoof. They've got nothing to show for their effort. So he knows how to get their attention. And with us, he knows how to get our attention. He knows the way to speak to us. Bless you. Do I need to say it a few more times? Bless you. Okay. He knows how to get our attention. He knows how to talk to each one of us. He knows what we will hear, what we will listen to, the things that will speak to us. And he won't speak to me in a way that I'm not going to see or hear. Now, that doesn't mean he's going to yell at me, but he will use the ways that I am able to listen to speak to me, because he knows what to say to me. He knows who I am. And so as soon as Peter hears John say that it's the Lord, he jumps in the water. He wraps his outer garment around him because he had taken it off, and he jumps in the water. The disciples follow to the shore, and they haul in this net full of fish. And there's this interesting thing where it tells us Peter climbs back into the boat. So he jumped out, made a rash decision. He starts to swim to shore. He gets back in the boat, helps bring the net to the shore, and it tells us that there were 153 fish. That's a good haul for one net. That's a lot of fish. They've hit their limit with one cast. It was full of large fish. And so Jesus says, "Come and have breakfast." And none of them dare to ask, "Well, who is this? Who are you?" Because they know it's the Lord. And so Jesus takes some bread and gives it to them, and he does the same with the fish. And again, with the setting here, he says he had taken off his outer garment, and now he throws it back on. And come on, Peter, you're killing me here, man. I could not fish like that. If you ever ask my father, I look ridiculous when I go fishing. I'm wearing long pants, a long shirt, a hat that covers everything. I have extra rags to wipe my hands on. It can be 100 degrees in the humidity of Tennessee, and I am dressed as if it's winter because I don't want to get anything on me. The fish, the bait, I hate getting that on me. And I don't know if you're a fisherman, you put a worm on a hook, a live worm, and your hand gets just covered in I don't even want to know. Right? I always tell myself that it's just dirt and mud, but I'm sure that it's not really just dirt and mud. And I love to fish, and I love fishing, and I always end up having to help if my boys are going because they don't want to do it right. And I remember my grandfather helped me, so I feel guilty if I don't help them. But I hate the stuff that deal all the details of fishing. I love fishing. I love eating fish. I love catching fish, but I hate everything else about fishing. And so Peter here is not only fishing, but he's fishing without clothes on. I don't know if I assume he's got something on, but he's got enough exposed areas that he can be covered in fish. It's driving me nuts. And so he throws his outer garment on. He jumps into the water, which again, I'm a little confused. If you're going to jump in the water, why not leave your outer garment to stay dry? Which, that's just me. I wouldn't want to get everything wet. So he goes, and the other question that I have in this scene as I look at this is, how does Jesus already have fish? I mean, he's sitting there, he's got a fire going, he's cooked some fish, he's got some bread. How does he have any of this? Did he just say, "Hey, fish, jump out of the water"? And I don't know. It just interests me. That's one of those little detail questions that I will ask him one day. And he'll look at me and say, "Really? That's what you want to ask me is how did I have the fish?" And I'll say, "I'm sorry, I'm just curious." So, but why don't they know who he is? They get to the shore, they look at him, they hear this, and it says that they don't dare ask him who he is, but they're looking at him and they don't recognize him. I mean, they know that it's Jesus. It says they know that it's the Lord, even though he isn't as recognizable as they would have expected. Sometimes when God speaks to us, when he calls to us, when he challenges us, sometimes we will just know because we recognize what he's saying or we recognize what he's doing, even if it doesn't look like what I would have expected. Because sometimes when Jesus is calling out to me or is moving in my life or he's using someone else to speak his words to me, there are moments where it doesn't look like what I would have expected, but boy, this sure sounds like Jesus. Or man, this sure looks like something he would do, but why is he using that person to talk to me? Or why would he speak in this particular situation? Because I want him to talk to me this way, and yet he's talking to me that way. And I know that I'm not the only one who struggles with that. I had people who I would trust speak into my life and help me know that God was leading me in a direction. But then there were times that he used people that I didn't want him to use to speak truth into my life, and that I didn't want to hear what they had to say. Or that it just didn't make sense. Why would you send this guy to talk to me? I don't know him. I don't like him. He's not my friend. Why would you use him to call me from where I'm at to where you're calling me to be? And my encouragement again is that God will not always be as recognizable as we like by outward appearance, but he is always easy to recognize because of what he's saying or what he's doing. Because there is just this feeling or this way that we know, well, this sure sounds like something Jesus would call me to. This sure looks like something that God would want me to do. There's a verse in Romans. Paul writes that faith comes from hearing the message. And the message is heard through the word about Christ. See, people believe when they hear this message about Jesus, but they don't hear the message if people don't share the word of God. And that both means the Bible and then just simply what we say. You guys are going to have to deal with some preaching changes in the coming weeks and months. I've noticed, I'm going to try to learn how to do this. I've noticed this is totally not connected to the message, so just bear with me for a moment. I listened to a couple different pastors, and one who is up in Wenatchee that I really like. When he needs to take a drink of water, he says, say to your neighbor whatever it is. And so he uses that moment to take a drink of water. So I'm going to start making you guys say things to each other every now and then, just some little thing like, look at your neighbor and say, Jesus loves you, or whatever. And I'll use those moments to take a drink. So just be prepared. I'm moving us in a very half-quarter step, if you will, toward a more charismatic approach to preaching where we start to be involved. So I just want you to be aware ahead of time. I'm not asking you to shout just yet. When I need to take a drink, you're going to have to start talking. So, faith, people believing in God, people coming to a saving faith. It comes from hearing this message, this good news. It comes from hearing about Jesus. That message is heard through the word, the teaching, preaching, declaration, and reading about Christ. How do we do that? How do we share about Jesus? How do we share our story? And one of the challenges I think we face is that often we don't feel like we're good enough. Because just like Peter, we see this Jesus and we see what he does and we hear what he says and we say, I could never be good enough to talk about this Jesus, or I don't know enough to share about this Jesus. I could never be one of the ones that you want to use, Lord, because I'm sinful, or I have this past, or I've done these things. And what I would say to you is the maybe phrase here, and this is the one that I want us to walk away with the most this morning, is that maybe God is calling you to simply be you with him. So often, we don't feel like we're good enough. And I don't think that that's just a me problem. I don't think that that's just a little self-esteem issue. I don't think that that's one of those kind of struggles. I think that this is just a universal human worry that I'm not good enough for God. And if the message is heard through the word about Christ and people come to salvation and faith because of that message about Christ, then what do I say about Christ? What does my life say about Christ? Are people hearing my faith? Do the people around me hear this message, hear about the word about Christ because of my life, because of what I say, because of what I do, because of how I interact with my family, with my friends, with my wife? Do they look at me and see someone and say, I feel like I know more about Jesus because I know Zach? Because I think that that's what God wants to do with my life. And we cannot effectively live out who God has called each one of us to be if we constantly live in a place of shame, guilt, fear, hiding. If you were here last Sunday or heard the message, I talked about coming out of the empty tomb, coming into new life, that he calls us away from the empty tomb. He calls us away from what we felt like was a life of death, and he calls us out into a new life where we don't have to hide anymore. We don't have to carry our coverings that we hide behind with us because they're folded up in the tomb and we can leave them behind. And he calls us to be us with him. He calls us to still live, just live resurrected with Jesus. God isn't calling you to be someone else. He's calling you to be the you that he created with him. And now the with him is a significant part of that. With him means grace, salvation. It means leaving behind sin. It means being holy and righteous and being powerful in the Spirit of God. It means that we are no longer who we once were, but we are now who he has called us to be. So it's a significant little prepositional phrase at the end. My dad would be really proud of me right there. It's a significant little phrase that we are with him. And he calls Peter and the others because he already knows who Peter is. Peter thinks that he's the sinful man and that Jesus should stay away from him. And I'm willing to bet that that's how Peter still feels in John chapter 21. He's denied Jesus 3 times. He failed him in a major way. And I'm assuming that Peter is feeling low. In fact, he's feeling so low that he decides that he probably just needs to go back to who he was before he ever met Jesus. I'm going to go back to being a fisherman because there's no way that he's still going to use me. I mean, he said that on this rock I will build my church, but man, I didn't look much like a rock when he needed me to. And I'm just going to go back to being the fisherman. Jesus, however, sees who Peter is and who he has been all along. He's not fooled by the mistakes. He sees who Peter is going to be. It tells us later on in the book of Acts, and somewhere it's chapter 5, I believe, it tells us that as Peter would go through the towns, people would line the streets with the sick and the hurting, so that as Peter walked by, they could simply be in his shadow and be healed by the shadow of Peter. I mean, talk about a transition from the guy who denied Jesus, who didn't feel good enough, the sinful man, the one who went back to fishing, become someone that people want to be around so much that if they can just be in his shadow, they don't even have to touch him, he doesn't have to touch them, he doesn't have to say a word. If the sun is out, then you can be healed if you're close enough to Peter. That's all it is. I was telling Ethan this week that we were going to get him some sleeveless shirts, and there's a phrase that the Indiana University football team would use because their stadium is an open stadium and they played a lot of day games on Saturdays, and one of their phrases was "Sun's out, guns out." So I told Ethan I was going to get him a sleeveless shirt that said "Sun's out, guns out." And in this moment, it's that same idea, right, with Peter, that when the sun's out, the guns are out for Peter, right? That's the guy you want to be around. The sun is out, the shadow is cast, and you want to be around this same Peter who was too sinful to think he could ever be something for Jesus. Maybe God has a bigger story for you than what you do. And that's where we're going to go in the next few weeks. Maybe God is simply calling you to be you. And as we learn to listen to Him, I think that by the end of this 6 weeks, we'll know what that means to be us with Him. And how He's speaking into our lives, even where we are and who we are. And how He can use us in the church, in our community, in the kingdom of God, to help people hear about Christ. So that their lives can go from feeling like they're the kind of people that the church will collapse if they come in, to recognizing that no, they're the kind of people that God's power can change in such a drastic way that anyone who is just simply in their vicinity is changed by their presence. Because that's who He has called each of us to be. Would you bow your heads with me as we pray? Lord, we thank you for your word. And we thank you for grace that changes who we were into who you have called us to be. And that when you look at us, you don't see who we think we are, you see who you made us to be. So Lord, I praise you that your truth wins out. And I know for many of us there are undoubtedly issues here where we think that, I don't know, I feel like I'm disqualified from this because of that choice I made or that struggle I've dealt with my whole life or this issue or my family's issues or whatever it might be. And Lord, I pray that you would speak truth into our lives. That just like with Peter, you would not let our excuses get in the way of who you have called us to be. That you would help us to see our heart the way you see our heart. That you would help us to see that you already know who we are. That we would look for the ways that you are speaking to us and that we would be able to recognize, especially over these next 5 weeks, that we would recognize your voice. That we would look for the ways that you get our attention. That we would trust your voice. And that we would trust you that you made us who we are on purpose. That we are good enough for you to use. In fact, we are made just perfectly to be used by you in the way that you have, in the place and the way that you have placed us and made us. So Lord, please speak to us. Encourage us and lift us up. We pray in the powerful name of Jesus, our Savior, the one who changes our name. The one who calls us brothers and sisters and sons and daughters of the Most High God. Amen.